A deal has been signed. After more than 100 days of war, thousands of strikes, and a global economy shaken to its core, the United States and Iran have agreed to a memorandum of understanding that is set to be formally signed in Geneva on June 19th. President Trump announced it with 3 words: "Let the oil flow." And just like that, the guns went quiet. But here is the question that every analyst, every diplomat, and every citizen in the affected region is now asking: who actually won? Because both sides are claiming victory. And when 2 sides claim victory at the same time, from the same agreement, it usually means the answer is not simple. It means the truth is buried somewhere between the headlines, inside the fine print of a document that neither government has fully released to the public. So let us go there. Let us look at what this deal actually says, what it leaves unresolved, and what it tells us about who came out of this war with more than they went in with. To understand the answer, you first have to understand what each side actually wanted when this war began. For the United States, the stated objectives were clear. Washington wanted Iran's nuclear program dismantled. It wanted the Strait of Hormuz open and permanently free of Iranian control. It wanted Iran's support for regional proxy forces in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, to end. And it wanted, in the words of some senior officials, to fundamentally change the behavior of the Iranian regime. For Iran, the goals were different in nature, but equally firm. Tehran wanted to survive. It wanted to preserve its nuclear capabilities. It wanted economic relief from sanctions that had strangled its economy for years. And it wanted recognition, not just as a regional power, but as a state that could withstand the military force of the United States and Israel and still negotiate from a position of standing. Those were the starting points. Now let us look at where things ended. The most immediate outcome of the deal is the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. This was the single most economically disruptive consequence of the war. For weeks, nearly 1/5 of the world's oil and natural gas supply sat stranded, unable to move through the world's most critical maritime choke point. Oil prices surged above $100 per barrel. American gas prices topped $4 per gallon. Global inflation ticked upward as supply chains absorbed the shock. The reopening of the strait is a genuine win for the United States, for global markets, and for the dozens of nations whose economies were directly affected by the closure. But here is where it gets complicated. Iran has not permanently surrendered control of the Strait of Hormuz. What has been agreed is a framework for its reopening, with the details of long-term management still to be negotiated. Iran's position going into this war was that it had the right to impose tolls on vessels passing through the strait. That demand has not been formally dropped. It has been deferred. And in diplomacy, deferred often means preserved. Now let us turn to the question that animated this entire conflict from the beginning: Iran's nuclear program. The United States entered this war with a clear demand: dismantle the program, surrender the enriched uranium, shut down the facilities at Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow. What the Memorandum of Understanding actually contains is something far more limited. Iran has agreed to commit, for the second time in its modern history, to never pursuing a nuclear weapon. It has agreed to enter into 60 days of technical negotiations on the future of its enrichment program. But it has not agreed to dismantle anything. It has not surrendered its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. It has not shut down a single facility. Those outcomes are supposed to be addressed in a second phase of negotiations, during a 60-day window that experts already describe as insufficient for the complexity of what needs to be resolved. The last time the United States and Iran successfully completed a nuclear deal was in 2015, and it took 2 full years of negotiations to get there. 60 days is not 2 years, and Tehran knows that. There is another dimension to this that rarely receives the attention it deserves: Iran's economy. Sanctions relief was one of Iran's core demands going into any negotiated settlement. According to reporting on the draft memorandum, the United States is expected to issue Treasury Department waivers for the export of Iranian crude oil and petrochemical products immediately after the signing. Frozen Iranian funds and assets are expected to be released in stages tied to progress in future negotiations. This is a significant economic concession. Iran's economy sustained an estimated $300 billion to $1 trillion in damage over the course of this conflict. Access to frozen funds and resumed oil exports represents meaningful financial relief for a government that urgently needs it. So let us take stock of where this leaves us. The United States achieved a cessation of hostilities and the reopening of a critical global trade route. Those are real and meaningful outcomes. But the original war aims, dismantling Iran's nuclear program, ending its proxy network, reshaping its regional behavior, none of those have been achieved. They have been rescheduled. Iran, for its part, preserved its nuclear infrastructure. It retained its regional presence. It secured the prospect of economic relief. And it demonstrated something that carries its own strategic weight: that it could absorb the combined military force of the United States and Israel for more than 100 days, lose its supreme leader, suffer catastrophic infrastructure damage, and still negotiate a deal that left its core assets intact. That is not nothing. In fact, for a nation that many expected to collapse under this level of pressure, it may be the most significant outcome of all. There is a third perspective here that tends to get lost in the binary framing of winners and losers. The global economy paid an enormous price for this war. Energy markets were disrupted for months. Shipping costs soared. Inflation pressures that were already present in many economies were made worse. Supply chains absorbed the shock, but they did not absorb it cleanly. And the underlying vulnerabilities that this conflict exposed have not disappeared. The Strait of Hormuz remains a choke point. Iran remains a nuclear threshold state. The region remains defined by layers of unresolved conflict, from Lebanon to Iraq to the waters of the Persian Gulf. What the deal has done is pause the immediate crisis. What it has not done is resolve the structural conditions that created it. The analysts and institutions that have examined the agreement most closely, from the Atlantic Council to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, have reached a similar conclusion. This is a framework deal. It reduces immediate violence. It reopens maritime traffic. It buys time. But it defers the hardest questions to a second phase of negotiations that will face significant domestic resistance in both Washington and Tehran. In the United States, the deal is already drawing criticism from those who argue that Iran kept too much. In Iran, it is drawing criticism from those who argue their government gave up too much. When a deal is criticized simultaneously by hardliners on both sides, it can mean one of two things. Either it is a genuine compromise that neither side fully wanted, or it is an agreement that uses the language of compromise to paper over disagreements that remain fundamentally unresolved. Only the next 60 days and the negotiations that follow will tell us which of those descriptions is accurate. So who won? The honest answer is that neither side achieved everything it wanted. The United States did not dismantle Iran's nuclear program. Iran did not receive a guaranteed path to international recognition or permanent sanctions relief. Both sides avoided a prolonged conflict that was becoming increasingly costly. Both sides gained something they needed in the short term, and both sides deferred the most difficult questions to a future conversation that may be harder than the one they just had. What this moment represents is not a resolution. It is a pause. A significant, necessary, and welcome pause, but a pause nonetheless. The Strait of Hormuz will reopen. Oil will flow again. Markets will stabilize. And the world will move on to the next headline. But the questions that started this war, the nuclear question, the regional power question, the question of what Iran's role in the Middle East ultimately looks like, those questions are still open. They are scheduled for a follow-up meeting that may never happen on the terms either side is expecting. That is the nature of agreements reached under the pressure of exhaustion, rather than the clarity of resolution. They stop the bleeding, but they do not heal the wound. And that is where we are. Not at the end of something, at the beginning of what comes next.